The blood that rotted in Appalachia, the family who tried to outrun their own genetics. This is the story of a lineage that believed isolation would preserve their legacy, but instead, it became the very force that destroyed them from within. Deep in the hollows of eastern Kentucky, where the mountains rise like ancient guardians and the forests swallow entire valleys in shadow, there existed a family that time forgot. The Callaway clan settled in these remote hills in 1847, seeking refuge from a world they deemed corrupt and dangerous. What began as a quest for purity and preservation would transform into one of the most disturbing cases of familial isolation in American history. The patriarch, Josiah Callaway, arrived in Appalachia with his wife Martha and their 7 children, determined to build a community untainted by outside influence. He purchased 300 acres of mountainous terrain, so remote that the nearest town was a 2-day journey on horseback. Josiah's vision was clear. His descendants would marry only within the family, preserving what he called the sacred Callaway essence. He believed that mixing with outsiders would dilute their strength, their values, their very souls. By 1865, the family had grown to 23 members, all living in a cluster of cabins connected by worn dirt paths. The eldest son, Thomas, married his first cousin, Eleanor. Their union was celebrated as the first step in maintaining the family's genetic legacy. No one questioned the patriarch's wisdom. No one dared to look beyond the mountain ridges to see what the rest of the world was doing. The winter of 1872 brought the first signs that something was profoundly wrong. Eleanor gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. The boy, named Josiah after his grandfather, appeared healthy at first glance. But as weeks turned to months, it became clear that young Josiah was different. His eyes didn't track movement properly. His limbs trembled with an unnatural palsy. By his first birthday, he still couldn't sit upright without support. The girl, Mary, seemed healthier, though her growth was slower than expected. The family physician, who traveled from the distant town twice a year, examined young Josiah with growing concern. "This child has afflictions I've seen before, Doctor," Harrison told Thomas and Eleanor in hushed tones. "In families that keep their unions close, the old blood, when it circles back on itself, sometimes carries hidden weaknesses. These weaknesses amplify, generation after generation." But old Josiah Callaway dismissed the doctor's warnings as the meddling of an outsider who couldn't understand their ways. "We are strong because we are pure," he declared at the family gathering that evening. "This is merely a test of our faith and commitment." The family nodded in agreement, their belief in the patriarch's vision unshaken. By 1880, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. Of the 47 Callaways now living on the mountain, 11 children showed various degrees of physical and mental challenges. Some had severe vision problems, their eyes clouded by early cataracts. Others suffered from seizures that would strike without warning, leaving them convulsing on the cabin floors. 3 children were born with malformed limbs, their bones twisted in ways that made walking nearly impossible. Thomas's sister, Rebecca, had married their cousin Jacob. Their 4 children represented the most severe manifestations yet. The eldest, at age 6, couldn't speak beyond simple sounds. The second child, a girl of 4, had never walked. The twins born last year both exhibited a peculiar facial structure, their features compressed in a way that made breathing difficult. Rebecca wept often, hidden away in her cabin, questioning what sin she had committed to deserve such trials. The isolation that was meant to protect the Callaways now became their prison. The journey to the nearest town was long and treacherous, discouraging most family members from seeking outside help or information. The few who did venture out were met with suspicious stares and whispered comments. Word had spread about those mountain people who marry their own kind. The stigma kept the Callaways even more isolated. reinforcing their belief that the outside world was hostile and dangerous. In 1885, young Mary Callaway, now 13 and one of the healthier members of her generation, began keeping a diary. Her entries, discovered decades later in a rotting trunk, provide a haunting window into daily life on Callaway Mountain. "Cousin James had another spell today," she wrote in careful script. "He fell into the fire during supper. Papa and Uncle Thomas pulled him out, but his arm is badly burned. Mama says we must pray harder. Grandpa Josiah says our faith is being tested. But I wonder, in the silence of night, if perhaps we are the ones doing the testing and failing." The family's economic situation had deteriorated as well. With so many children requiring constant care, fewer hands were available for the hard work of mountain farming. The fields grew weedy and unproductive. The livestock dwindled as no one had the energy to properly tend them. The Callaways, once self-sufficient and proud, now struggled to feed themselves through harsh Appalachian winters. Confide if you are already subscribed to this channel, because here we uncover the hidden stories that history tried to bury, the truths that make us uncomfortable, that force us to confront the darkest corners of human choices. Subscribe now, because some secrets demand to be told, and you'll want to be here when we reveal them. By 1892, old Josiah Callaway had passed away at the age of 78, still convinced his vision had been righteous. His son Thomas, now the family patriarch, faced an impossible situation. The third generation of Callaways was coming of age, and the marriage possibilities were becoming increasingly limited and problematic. Every potential match was between second or third cousins, sometimes closer. The genetic pool had become a stagnant pond, breeding nothing but suffering. Thomas's nephew, Daniel Callaway, was 19 years old and considered one of the healthiest young men in the family. He could read and write, a rarity among the younger generation. He worked the fields without the tremors that plagued so many of his cousins. But Daniel had begun to notice patterns that terrified him. He saw how each generation was weaker than the last, how the children born in recent years were struggling to survive their first winters, how mental clarity was becoming as rare as physical health. One spring morning in 1893, Daniel made a decision that would fracture the family forever. He packed a small bag, took what little money he had saved, and walked down the mountain toward the town. He didn't tell anyone of his plans. He simply left, determined to escape the cycle that was consuming his family from within. In town, Daniel found work at a lumber mill. The other workers were initially suspicious of the mountain boy, but Daniel proved himself a hard worker and quick learner. More importantly, he met Sarah Mitchell, the daughter of the mill owner. Sarah was educated, worldly by mountain standards, and curious about the mysterious Callaway family she'd heard whispered about in town. Daniel and Sarah's courtship was cautious. Daniel was terrified to tell her about his family, about the cousins who couldn't walk, the siblings who couldn't speak, the generations of intermarriage that had created a legacy of suffering. When he finally confessed, expecting rejection and disgust, Sarah surprised him. "You're not your family's choices," she said firmly. "You had the courage to leave. That's what matters." They married in the fall of 1894. Daniel's family, learning of his betrayal, considered him dead. His name was never spoken again on Callaway Mountain. He had violated the most sacred rule. He had brought in outside heritage, contaminating the pure Callaway line. But Daniel's escape had planted seeds of doubt among the younger Callaways. His cousin, Elizabeth, 19, and facing pressure to marry her second cousin, Robert, began asking questions that no one wanted to answer. "Why are we the only ones this happens to?" she demanded at a family meeting. "I've been to town, I've seen other families, their children are healthy, they can run and play and learn. Why not ours?" The elders had no answers that satisfied her. They spoke of faith, of tradition, of the importance of preserving the Callaway way. But Elizabeth had seen enough. She knew deep in her bones that something was fundamentally wrong with their choices. The evidence was everywhere. In every cabin where a mother wept over a struggling child, in every grave marker of an infant who hadn't survived their first year, in every young adult who would never experience the fullness of life because their body or mind had been compromised before they were even born. The winter of 1896 was particularly brutal. Heavy snows isolated the mountain community completely for 3 months. During that time, 2 more children died, their weakened bodies unable to fight off simple illnesses. The family gathered for the burials, standing in the frozen cemetery where more than 30 small graves marked the lives of children who never had a chance. Thomas Callaway, now in his 60s, stood before the fresh graves and felt the weight of generations pressing down on him. His grandfather's vision had promised strength through purity. Instead, they had created a dynasty of suffering. But admitting that would mean acknowledging that everything they had sacrificed, every outsider they had rejected, every choice they had made, had been catastrophically wrong. In town, Daniel and Sarah welcomed their first child in the spring of 1897. A healthy baby girl they named Hope. The irony wasn't lost on Daniel. This child, born of mixed heritage, carried more hope for the future than any pure heritage Callaway born on the mountain in the last 30 years. She would grow up strong, educated, free from the genetic burden that had crushed his cousins and siblings. Word of Hope's birth eventually reached Callaway Mountain through traveling merchants. The news created a schism. Some family members saw it as proof of Daniel's betrayal and the corruption of outsider influence, but others, particularly among the younger generation, saw it differently. They saw it as evidence that perhaps the elders had been wrong all along. Elizabeth Callaway made her decision on a warm June morning in 1898. She walked down the mountain, following the same path Daniel had taken 5 years earlier. She carried nothing but a small bundle of clothes and a determination to survive. Behind her, she left a promised marriage to Robert, a family that would consider her dead, and a legacy of genetic deterioration that had claimed too many lives already. In town, Elizabeth found Daniel and Sarah. They welcomed her into their home, helped her find work, and watched as she slowly transformed from a frightened mountain girl into a confident young woman. She met and married a merchant's son from Virginia. Her children, born healthy and strong, would never know the struggles that had defined her childhood. Back on Callaway Mountain, the exodus had begun. Over the next decade, more than 20 young Callaways would make the choice to leave, to seek marriages outside the family, to break the cycle. Each departure was mourned by the elders as a betrayal, but celebrated secretly by those who remained and understood what those escapes meant: survival. By 1908, only 15 Callaways remained on the mountain, mostly older family members and a few younger individuals too devoted to tradition or too compromised by health challenges to leave. The cabins fell into disrepair. The fields lay fallow. The grand experiment in familial purity had collapsed under the weight of its own internal contradictions. Thomas Callaway died in 1910 at the age of 73, surrounded by the remnants of his family. His last words, whispered to his daughter Mary, were haunting. "We thought we were preserving something sacred. We didn't understand we were destroying it." Mary recorded these words in the diary she had kept since childhood, a document that would later provide crucial insights into the family's decline. The third chapter of the Callaway story involves the children who were born with severe challenges and somehow survived into adulthood, living testaments to the consequences of genetic isolation. Their stories are perhaps the most heart-wrenching aspect of this saga. Joseph Callaway, born in 1884, was the son of first cousins Ruth and Benjamin. Joseph's challenges were evident from birth. His left leg was significantly shorter than his right, his spine curved in a severe scoliosis, and his cognitive development was profoundly delayed. By the age of 10, he could barely speak beyond simple words. By 20, his physical condition had deteriorated to the point where he rarely left his cabin. Joseph's sister Anna took care of him throughout his life. She herself had married a second cousin and had 2 children, both of whom showed their own set of challenges. Anna's days consisted of an endless cycle of care, feeding Joseph, helping him with basic functions, trying to communicate with a brother whose mind had been imprisoned by genetics he never chose. In a letter discovered years later, Anna wrote to a distant relative who had left the mountain, "I love my brother, but I wonder every day what his life might have been if we had been born into a different family. Would he have been able to walk properly, to think clearly, to experience joy beyond the simple pleasure of warm sunlight on his face?" Our grandfather's choices didn't just affect him, they robbed Joseph of a life worth living. And for what? For pride, for some notion of purity that has brought nothing but misery. Another survivor, Margaret Callaway, born in 1888, experienced severe vision problems from early childhood. By age 15, she was completely unable to see. In a community already isolated, Margaret's impairment created an additional layer of loneliness. She learned to navigate the familiar paths between cabins by memory and touch, but her world had shrunk to a series of sounds and textures. Margaret never married. In the Callaway tradition, even her compromised genetics were considered suitable for continuing the line, but she refused. "I won't bring another child into this world to suffer as I have," she reportedly told her mother. It was an act of rebellion, of breaking the cycle in the only way she could. Margaret lived until 1951, spending her final decades being cared for by relatives who had stayed on the mountain out of obligation or lack of alternatives. The physical manifestations of genetic isolation were documented by several physicians who visited the remaining Callaways over the years. A medical report from 1915 described findings that included unusually high rates of congenital disabilities, early onset vision and hearing loss, skeletal abnormalities, and what the doctors termed significant cognitive impairments in approximately 40% of family members examined. One physician, Dr. Samuel Pritchard, who specialized in hereditary conditions, visited Callaway Mountain in 1918 as part of a broader study of isolated mountain communities. His notes provide clinical detail to the human tragedy. The Callaway family presents as a textbook case of the dangers of sustained consanguineous relationships. Multiple generations of cousin marriages have resulted in the expression of numerous recessive genetic conditions. The family exhibits patterns consistent with increased homozygosity, resulting in the manifestation of deleterious recessive alleles that would remain hidden in a more genetically diverse population. Dr. Pritchard's report continued. "What strikes me most profoundly is not merely the clinical presentation of these conditions, but the human cost. I have examined children who will never run, adults who struggle with basic cognitive tasks, and elderly individuals caring for middle-aged offspring who require constant supervision. This family's deliberate isolation, undertaken with the intention of preservation, has instead created a cascade of suffering that spans generations. If you've watched this far, you're witnessing a truth that many would prefer to ignore. In the comments below, write these words from young Mary Callaway's diary. "We thought purity would save us, but it destroyed us instead." Let these words stand as a reminder of what happens when pride overrules reason. Write it now. Let your comment be part of the record. By the 1920s, the Callaway mountain settlement had essentially ceased to function as a viable community. Of the remaining family members, most were elderly or dealing with significant health challenges. The youngest generation, those born in the early 1900s, were few in number, and many had chosen not to have children, breaking the cycle that had defined their family for 3/4 of a century. The story of the Callaways began to reach a wider audience through the work of social researchers and journalists interested in Appalachian culture. In 1923, a journalist named Helen Crawford published an article titled "The Hidden Cost of Isolation," a Kentucky family's tragic experiment, in a regional newspaper. While she changed names and some details to protect the family's privacy, those familiar with the area knew exactly which family she was describing. Crawford's article sparked debate about the broader issue of isolated mountain communities and the genetic consequences of limited marriage pools. Some readers expressed sympathy for the Callaways, viewing them as victims of geographic isolation and limited education about genetics. Others were less forgiving, seeing their situation as the inevitable consequence of willful ignorance and stubborn pride. One aspect of the Callaway story that Crawford emphasized was the role of women in the family's decline. The Callaway matriarchs, she argued, were often aware of the problems earlier than the men, but lacked the power to change course. Martha Callaway, the original matriarch, had reportedly expressed concerns about cousin marriages to her husband Josiah as early as 1870, but her objections were dismissed. Similarly, several women in subsequent generations had questioned the wisdom of continued intermarriage, but were overruled by the patriarchal structure that dominated family decisions. The fourth chapter of this tragic saga explores the scientific understanding that could have prevented the Callaway family's suffering, knowledge that existed but never reached the isolated mountain community in time to make a difference. By the mid-1800s, when Josiah Callaway first established his mountain settlement, scientific understanding of heredity was rudimentary but not non-existent. Farmers and animal breeders had long understood that continuous interbreeding of closely related animals led to weakened offspring. The practice of line breeding was known to concentrate both desirable and undesirable traits. This folk wisdom, based on practical observation, could have informed the Callaway family's choices, but their isolation and conviction in their own rightness prevented such knowledge from penetrating their community. The formal scientific understanding of genetics was developing rapidly during the Callaway family's decline. Gregor Mendel's groundbreaking work on inheritance, published in 1866, established the fundamental principles of how traits pass from parents to offspring. While Mendel's work wasn't widely recognized until the early 1900s, the basic concepts he identified, particularly regarding recessive traits, directly explained what was happening on Callaway Mountain. In a population with diverse genetic backgrounds, harmful recessive alleles remain hidden, masked by dominant healthy alleles inherited from unrelated parents. But when cousins marry, they share a significant portion of their genetic material inherited from common grandparents. This dramatically increases the probability that both parents carry the same harmful recessive alleles. When both parents pass on these recessive variants, the child expresses the genetic condition. The Callaway family was experiencing what geneticists now call inbreeding depression, a reduction in fitness and health that occurs when closely related individuals reproduce over multiple generations. Each generation of cousin marriages increased the overall homozygosity of the family's genetic makeup, meaning family members became more and more genetically similar. This similarity, far from being the strength that Josiah Callaway envisioned, became a profound weakness. Dr. Margaret Stevens, a geneticist who studied the historical records of isolated communities in the 1960s, explained the Callaway situation this way. Imagine genetic diversity as a form of insurance. Each slightly different gene variant is like a backup plan. If one variant causes problems, you have another variant that can compensate. The Callaways systematically eliminated their genetic insurance policy. By the third and fourth generations, they had so little genetic diversity that there were no backup plans left. Harmful variants that would have remained silent in a diverse population were expressed in devastating ways. The medical conditions that plagued the Callaway family, from vision problems to skeletal abnormalities to cognitive impairments, were likely caused by multiple different recessive genetic conditions becoming concentrated in the family line. Without modern genetic testing, it's impossible to know exactly which conditions were involved, but the pattern is consistent with numerous well-documented genetic disorders that follow recessive inheritance patterns. One particularly relevant example is a condition documented in other isolated communities, a recessive form of early-onset vision loss caused by mutations in genes responsible for normal eye development. In a diverse population, carriers of this mutation might never encounter another carrier and thus never have affected children. But in a community where everyone is related, carriers frequently marry other carriers, and affected children are born in every generation. The tragedy of the Callaway story is amplified by timing. By the early 1900s, when the family's decline was most severe, the rediscovery of Mendel's work had sparked a revolution in biological understanding. Geneticists and physicians were beginning to understand the mechanisms of hereditary disease. Social reformers and public health advocates were starting to educate the public about the risks of consanguineous marriage. But this knowledge remained largely inaccessible to remote mountain communities like the Callaways. They had no access to medical journals, no contact with university researchers, no public health infrastructure to provide education and guidance. Their isolation, which had begun as a choice, had become a barrier that prevented potentially life-saving information from reaching them. In 1925, a social worker named Rebecca Thompson made the difficult journey to Callaway Mountain as part of a state-funded initiative to assess the health and welfare of isolated mountain families. What she found shocked her. Thompson's report, filed with the Kentucky Department of Health, described living conditions that were heartbreaking and unnecessary, with multiple individuals suffering from preventable hereditary conditions and a pervasive atmosphere of resignation and despair. Thompson attempted to convince the remaining Callaways to seek medical evaluations and genetic counseling for the younger members of the family. She explained in simple terms why cousin marriages had led to so many health problems. Some family members listened, their faces reflecting a mixture of understanding and grief for what might have been prevented. Others, particularly the eldest members, refused to accept her explanation, clinging to the belief that their suffering was a test of faith rather than the consequence of genetic reality. One elderly Callaway woman, identified in Thompson's notes only as Mrs. C, and told her, "You come here with your fancy words and your science, telling us we did wrong, but we did what we thought was right. We wanted to keep our family strong, to protect our children from the corruption of the outside world. How were we supposed to know that in trying to protect them, we were harming them? If your science is so smart, where was it 50 years ago when we needed it?" It was a fair question, one that Thompson struggled to answer. The knowledge had existed in academic circles, but it had never been effectively communicated to rural communities that needed it most. The Callaway tragedy was, in many ways, a failure not just of one family's judgment, but of society's ability to disseminate crucial public health information to all its citizens. By 1930, only 7 Callaways remained on the mountain, all elderly or middle-aged with significant health challenges. The grand settlement that Josiah Callaway had established 83 years earlier was dying. The cabins, once bustling with children and activity, stood empty, or housed solitary individuals struggling through their final years. The last Callaway to be born on the mountain was James in 1912. His parents were third cousins, and James inherited a complex constellation of health issues, severe scoliosis, significant vision impairment, and what modern medicine would likely diagnose as a developmental disability. James never married, never left the mountain, and spent his life in the care of aging relatives until he died in 1967 at the age of 55. The Callaway family's story entered its final chapter as the last survivors passed away between the 1950s and 1970s. The mountain settlement was gradually reclaimed by the forest. Cabins collapsed under years of rain and snow. The family cemetery, with its dozens of small graves, became overgrown with weeds and wild roses. But the legacy of the Callaways extended beyond the mountain. The descendants who had escaped, who had married outside the family and built lives in the broader world, carried with them the memories of what had been lost. Daniel Callaway's grandchildren, born healthy and thriving, grew up hearing stories about the mountain family their grandfather had fled. These stories became cautionary tales, passed down through generations as reminders of what can happen when isolation and pride override reason and compassion. In the 1970s, a graduate student in anthropology named Robert Hayes conducted an oral history project focused on Appalachian families. He interviewed several Callaway descendants, now scattered across multiple states. Their testimonies provided valuable insights into how the family's history had shaped their own lives and choices. One descendant, Margaret Ann Harrison, the great-granddaughter of Elizabeth Callaway, who had fled the mountain in 1898, told Hayes, "My great-grandmother rarely spoke about her early life, but when she did, her face would take on this haunted look. She told me once that she used to wake up at night, panicked, checking her children to make sure they were healthy and whole. The trauma of watching her cousins and siblings struggle, of wondering if she carried genes that would harm her own children, that never left her. Even though her kids were fine, even though the nightmare had ended, she carried the fear with her until she died." Another descendant, Thomas Callaway Mitchell, grandson of Daniel Callaway, shared a different perspective. "My grandfather made the hardest choice of his life when he walked down that mountain. He lost his entire family, every person he'd known since birth. He was called a traitor, declared dead by his own father, but he made that choice because he loved his future children more than he loved his past. He wanted us to have chances he never had. Every time I look at my own kids, healthy and happy, I think about the courage it took for him to break that cycle." The physical evidence of the Callaway settlement remained visible for decades. Hikers occasionally stumbled upon the ruins of cabins and the overgrown cemetery. In 1982, a historical preservation society attempted to document the site, but found that nature had reclaimed most structures. Only foundation stones and a few collapsed walls marked where the Callaways had lived and died. The cemetery proved more durable. Though overgrown, the grave markers remained, their inscriptions weathered but readable. The Preservation Society documented over 60 graves, more than half belonging to children under the age of 10. The dates told a clear story, a concentration of child deaths between 1870 and 1920, tapering off as the family declined and fewer children were born. Modern genetics has provided additional context for understanding what happened to the Callaway family. Studies of isolated populations around the world have consistently demonstrated the health consequences of sustained endogamy, the practice of marriage within a specific social or family group. From royal families in Europe to remote island populations, the pattern is always the same. Genetic diversity decreases, the frequency of recessive genetic conditions increases, and population health suffers. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a medical geneticist who has studied the history of consanguineous marriage in America, explains, "The Callaway case is particularly striking because it was intentional. Many isolated populations experience genetic drift and health consequences due to geographic isolation beyond their control. But the Callaways actively chose to limit their marriage pool, believing it would strengthen their family. It's a powerful example of how good intentions, combined with lack of scientific understanding, can lead to tragic outcomes. The ethical questions raised by the Callaway story remain relevant today. In an era of genetic testing and detailed family health histories, we have tools the Callaways never possessed. But the fundamental questions persist. What responsibility do we have to understand our genetic heritage? How do we balance respect for cultural traditions with scientific knowledge about health risks? How do we communicate complex genetic information to communities that may be skeptical of outside authorities? The Callaway descendants who participated in genetic studies in the 1990s and 2000s carried detectable signatures of their family's history. Higher than average rates of certain genetic variants associated with vision problems, skeletal conditions, and other health issues were documented in the population of individuals descended from the mountain Callaways. However, because these descendants had married outside the family for multiple generations, the harmful effects were greatly diminished. The genetic diversity introduced through outmarriage had essentially rescued the Callaway lineage from the trajectory of decline that had seemed inevitable on the mountain. As the 20th century ended and the 21st began, the Callaway story transitioned from living memory to historical record. The last person born on Callaway Mountain, James, had died in 1967. The last of the elderly Callaways who remembered the settlement in its heyday passed away in the 1980s. What remained were documents, photographs, oral histories, and the lessons that could be drawn from one family's tragic experiment in genetic isolation. The final documentation of the Callaway site came in 2008, when a team of anthropologists and historians conducted a comprehensive survey of the mountain settlement. Using ground-penetrating radar and careful excavation, they mapped the locations of all structures and confirmed the cemetery's extent. Their report concluded, "The Callaway settlement stands as a significant historical site, documenting the human cost of genetic isolation and the importance of genetic diversity for population health. It serves as a powerful educational resource for understanding both historical attitudes toward family structure and the scientific principles of heredity and population genetics." If you've watched this entire journey into the darkness of the Callaway family's choices, you understand why some stories must be told, no matter how uncomfortable. If you're still here, it means you're someone who doesn't look away from difficult truths. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can know who truly appreciates the depth of these stories. Hit that like button if this history moved you, because content like this requires courage to create and courage to watch. Share this video with someone who needs to understand how pride and isolation can destroy even the most well-intentioned families. And subscribe if you haven't already, because we'll continue uncovering the hidden tragedies that shaped our history, the stories that society tried to forget, but that we must remember. The Callaway story teaches us that strength doesn't come from purity or isolation, but from diversity, from connection, from the willingness to learn and adapt. The family that tried to outrun genetics by keeping their lineage closed instead ran straight into the very consequences they feared most: weakness, suffering, and eventual extinction. Their mountain, once a refuge, became a prison. Their pride, once a source of identity, became their downfall. And their blood, which they sought so desperately to keep pure, rotted from within, one generation at a time, until nothing remained but empty cabins, weathered gravestones, and a cautionary tale for future generations. This is what happens when we forget that human strength has always come not from what we keep out, but from what we let in. The Callaways learned this lesson far too late, and paid for it with decades of suffering that never should have been.